Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we talk about applied physics or, structural engineering, there is this comforting expectation of predictability.
Yeah, a set of reliable rules.
Right. You calculate the mass, you apply a specific amount of kinetic force, and you can predict exactly when a concrete pillar is going to shatter. It is clean, it is mathematical, and highly visible.
I mean, it is a simple equation of inputs and outputs, really. You strike something hard enough, and it breaks.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of geopolitics and ideological conflict, and suddenly you encounter materials that fundamentally refuse to obey those simple rules.
Oh, they absolutely refuse.
Right? You strike the structure, fully expecting it to shatter, and instead, the impact itself seems to change the composition of the material. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a non-Newtonian fluid. The harder you hit it, the more rigid and impenetrable it becomes.
That is such a fascinating way to frame it, because that exact dynamic is the fundamental blind spot in the doctrine of material dominance we are exploring today.
Yeah, which is why the source material today, the clash of ideologies, Trump v. Khamenei, is so revealing. This is not just a disagreement over borderlines or trade agreements. It is a total collision between two entirely incompatible doctrines of national survival.
And we are looking at a landscape where the standard metrics of destruction simply do not translate into capitulation.
Exactly.
On one side, you have the perspective championed by Donald Trump, asserting that decisive material force, economic dominance, and tangible military results are the ultimate determinants of victory. I will be representing this position today, the argument that material power exposes systemic weakness and dictates reality.
And on the other side, you have the doctrine articulated by Ali Khamenei. His position posits that ideological endurance, adaptation, and unity render physical and economic dominance fundamentally ineffective. So I will be taking this perspective today.
Right.
I will be arguing that in a conflict of this magnitude, resistance is the superior metric for long-term survival, and that material superiority is ultimately neutralized by ideological persistence. So the central tension here is whether overwhelming tangible force inevitably wins out, or if an intangible resistance can actually outlast it. And looking at the text from a perspective of material dominance, the evidence for the primacy of tangible power is unambiguous.
Well, unambiguous from a purely results-oriented lens, maybe.
But that is the lens that matters in war. Trump's framework is entirely ruthlessly results-oriented. He points out that for years, limits were being pushed, right? Threats, proxies, regional instability.
Yeah, the text definitely highlights that buildup.
Right, and his solution was not philosophical, it was intensely physical. Taking out leadership, destroying infrastructure, abruptly ending the capacity of the opponent to project power.
Which you have to ask, does taking out a leader or a building actually end that capacity? Or does it just, change its shape?
It is binary because the physical world is binary. The empirical proof of this doctrine is the observable collapse of the opponent's systems. Let us be incredibly concrete about what this pressure means on the ground.
Okay, let us look at the ground reality.
We are not talking about abstract political tension here. We are talking about foreign reserves being frozen overnight. We are talking about inflation spiking so rapidly that a citizen's life savings evaporate, and supply chains for basic goods just halt.
Right, the economic devastation is undeniably real.
Exactly. When an economy is failing under the weight of overwhelming sanctions, that is objective evidence that material strength dictates terms. You apply pressure, the system fractures, and you control the situation.
See, but you are equating economic pain with systemic collapse, and those are two very different phenomena.
Are they, though?
Yes, absolutely. Drawing on Khamenei's framework, there is a massive, critical blind spot in that purely material strategy. The assumption is that overwhelming physical force equals control.
Because it usually does.
In applied physics, maybe, but Khamenei argues that bringing aggression, like bombing a sovereign nation or starving its economy, does not actually demonstrate strength. It demonstrates arrogance.
Arrogance? How does being able to unilaterally crash an economy demonstrate arrogance rather than power?
Because geopolitically, arrogance is a vulnerability.
It completely misdiagnoses the nature of the war being fought. He explicitly states in the text, "You misunderstand war. War is not just weapons, it is ideology."
Okay, but you say the system has not collapsed. How does ideology practically compensate for a dismantled infrastructure? I mean, really.
It compensates by shifting the metric of survival.
But if a nation's physical infrastructure is being systematically destroyed, and its economic system is objectively collapsing under comprehensive sanctions, how does faith practically function to sustain a state apparatus?
Well,
Faith does not run a water treatment plant. Faith does not fund proxy militias. Faith does not stabilize a rapidly devaluing currency.
no, you are right. Faith does not run the water treatment plant. But it radically alters what happens politically when the water treatment plant goes offline.
How so?
You are looking at the state purely as an administrative machine, rather than a social contract bound by ideology. When Khamenei says pressure creates resistance, not surrender, he is explaining a psychological and sociological mechanism.
Right, but psychological mechanisms do not fix pipes.
No, but they prevent the society from imploding when the pipes break. In a purely material framework, the one Trump operates in, if the economy collapses, the population inevitably rebels against the state to restore their material comfort.
Which is exactly the intended design of a maximum pressure campaign. You squeeze the economy until the domestic friction becomes unbearable for the leadership.
Precisely. But that design shatters when you introduce the variable of a unifying ideology triggered by external aggression. This is that non-Newtonian fluid in action.
Wait, so you are saying the pain actually strengthens the state?
Yes. When the economic hardship is perceived not as a failure of domestic governance, but as a deliberate attack by an arrogant foreign power, the pain ceases to be a catalyst for domestic rebellion.
I find that hard to believe in a prolonged scenario.
But that is what happens. Instead of rebellion, it becomes a badge of shared sacrifice. The external force triggers an adaptive survival mechanism. The populace unites against the external threat.
So faith stops the missile?
So no, faith does not stop the missile midair, but it entirely neutralizes the political objective of the missile, which is to break the will of the state.
I hear the theory. I really do. But let us look at the actual reality on the ground. Even if we accept that ideology increases a population's tolerance for suffering, tolerance is not a substitute for capability.
It is a prerequisite for endurance, though.
Sure, but Trump points out that by taking out leadership, you control the situation. Let us use a structural demolition analogy here, since we started with engineering.
Okay, go for it.
If you are tasked with bringing down a massive fortified building, it does not matter how passionately the original architect believed in the vision of the building. It does not matter how dedicated the maintenance staff is.
Because you are blowing it up.
Exactly. If you systematically plant explosives on the load-bearing pillars, if you take out the top generals, destroy the financial infrastructure, eliminate the military capabilities, the building falls.
Right.
Gravity takes over. The architect's belief cannot suspend the laws of physics. Victory, in Trump's highly pragmatic view, is when the building is on the ground.
The fatal flaw in that demolition analogy is that an ideologically galvanized nation is not a static building made of dead concrete.
Well, it is a structure.
No, it is a living biological entity. Khamenei asserts that missiles do not stop faith, and he tells Trump that is why your wars never truly end. When you blow up a pillar in a building, the building cannot rebuild itself.
Right?
But when you attack a living organism, you trigger an immune response.
An immune response? Okay, but if you take out the central nervous system, the top strategists, the nodes of communication, the ideological fervor of the populace does not spontaneously generate a new command and control structure?
In a decentralized network, it actually might.
A biological entity can still be destroyed if the trauma is severe enough. The machine is still broken.
Only if you define winning as breaking a rigid machine. But an ideological network does not operate like a traditional military hierarchy, where removing the top general causes the whole army to freeze.
But it certainly disrupts operations.
It disrupts them, sure, but in an ideologically driven system, leaders are replaceable nodes in a massive, decentralized network of belief. A martyr general is not just a lost tactician.
They become a symbol.
Exactly. They become a symbol, a catalyst that accelerates recruitment and solidifies resolve. So when Trump says he expects the other side to give up, he is waiting for a concrete building to fall.
And you are saying it will not fall.
When Khamenei says you may destroy buildings, but you cannot destroy belief, he is pointing out that the state's true foundation is the ideological commitment of the people. Because you cannot bomb an idea, you can never achieve that neat binary victory where the opponent formally signs a surrender document.
So it just goes on forever?
The war never ends, it merely shifts into a new phase of adaptation.
Okay, but if the war never truly ends, as Khamenei suggests, and the nation is trapped in a perpetual state of adaptation and survival against an overwhelmingly superior material force, how is that not just a slow, agonizing defeat?
Because survival is its own victory in that framework.
Let us step into the shoes of the listener for a second. For anyone listening who lives in a Western democracy, this can be incredibly hard to wrap your head around.
Oh, absolutely.
We are conditioned to measure the success of a state by its economic prosperity, its integration into the global market, and the rising standard of living for its citizens, right?
Yes, material flourishing.
So when a leader demands indefinite, generational suffering just to maintain ideological purity, it sounds like madness. It sounds like a profound failure of governance.
Well, it sounds like madness if your ultimate metric for a successful life is material comfort.
But it is not just comfort. It is basic human flourishing. Trump zeroes in on exactly this tangible cost. He pivots directly to the morality of this ideological endurance.
Right. The critique of leadership.
Yeah, he says, and for decades you isolated your country. Sanctions, restrictions. Your people suffered. That's not leadership. And then he hits on perhaps the most devastating critique of the resistance framework.
Which is?
Your people didn't choose that suffering. They were forced into it.
That is a powerful moral critique, undoubtedly.
It is the core of the material dominance philosophy. The primary duty of a state is the prosperity and security of its citizens. True strength is supposed to protect the nation from suffering.
But protect them at what cost?
Demanding that your citizens endure a degraded state of existence, cut off from global innovation, struggling for basic resources, all in the name of an abstract ideological resistance? Trump's assertion is that real strength protects the nation. It does not hold its own population hostage to an endless war of attrition.
Okay, but let us examine the alternative that material dominance is actually offering here. Khamenei's counter-framework reframes that suffering not as a failure of governance, but as a mandatory toll on the road to actual sovereignty.
A mandatory toll.
Yes. He states sacrifice is part of independence. Freedom is not given, it is defended. From the resistance perspective, the prosperity offered by capitulating to Trump's material dominance is a complete illusion.
How is a functioning economy an illusion?
Because it is a prosperity strictly conditional on subjugation. Yes, if you bow to the pressure, you might get your sanctions lifted, you might get access to global markets, but you instantly lose your autonomy.
I see.
You become a client state, entirely dependent on the whims of the dominant power.
But is absolute autonomy worth the absolute degradation of the standard of living for an entire population? If your independence means your citizens cannot afford medicine, what is the practical value of that independence?
Khamenei would argue the practical value is existence itself. And he counters the moral critique by questioning the moral authority of the dominant power enforcing this suffering.
By pointing out their flaws.
Right. He asks, and your system, does it truly represent all voices? He is asserting that a system reliant on sheer dominance, on bombing sovereign nations and enforcing brutal economic blockades to get its way, is inherently unjust.
But it is effective.
Trump argues that the world respects power, and therefore capitulation to power is just the pragmatic reality of global politics. But Khamenei draws a sharp, vital distinction between fear and respect. He says, the world may fear power, but it does not respect injustice.
But fear is highly effective. I mean, if allies fall in line with sanctions and global corporations pull out of a country because they fear the dominant power's financial system, that is material dominance actively dictating the terms of reality.
In the short term, yes.
It does not matter if they respect you or fear you. The outcome on the ground is identical. The dominant power gets its way.
In the short term, yes.
And this is where the two paradigms completely diverge on their timeline of reality. Khamenei is playing a much longer historical game.
A generational even.
Exactly. The defining irony of this entire clash is that the application of material force is the exact fuel required to sustain the ideological resistance.
Wait, fuel?
Yes. Overwhelming force does not just fail to break the system, it stress tests and validates Khamenei's entire worldview to his populace.
Which leads us directly to how these two worldviews synthesize, or frankly, completely fail to synthesize, their ultimate historical outcomes. Trump distills his entire philosophy into one incredibly blunt sentence.
Results matter more than opinions.
Right. It is the ultimate pragmatic statement. It does not matter if you think the sanctions are unjust. It does not matter if you think the military strikes are arrogant or aggressive.
The physical reality is what it is.
Exactly. The unchangeable result is that your infrastructure's gone, your economy is isolated, and our power is undisputed. That is reality. You can have all the ideology you want, but you cannot opine your way out of a destroyed economy.
And Khamenei completely rejects that immediate snapshot timeframe. He responds with a historical thesis. He says, history remembers both. Empires built on force fall. Nations built on belief endure.
A bold claim.
He is arguing that the material results Trump is so proud of are actually incredibly fragile because force requires a constant, exhausting expenditure of resources to maintain.
Well, maintaining a global presence is expensive.
Incredibly expensive. You have to keep funding the military. You have to keep enforcing the sanctions. You have to keep policing the globe. Belief, on the other hand, is self-sustaining. It does not cost billions of dollars to maintain a shared ideology of resistance.
Yet when Trump says, "We'll see who lasts," he is pointing to the massive, undeniable disparity in those material resources. The United States can afford to project force indefinitely.
Can it, though?
Relatively speaking, yes. A system collapsing under sanctions cannot afford to resist indefinitely. At some point, the physical reality must override the ideological endurance. The gravity has to take hold.
And Khamenei's final chilling response, "we already have," indicates that the resistance framework considers simply surviving the initial onslaught of material force as total proof of concept.
Just enduring is winning.
Yes, the fact that the ideology has not collapsed under decades of unprecedented, coordinated global pressure is to them empirical proof that belief can indeed outlast force. They did not shatter. The non-Newtonian fluid held.
It is a remarkable impasse. From the perspective of material dominance, the evidence remains highly compelling. The physical reality of dismantled infrastructure, neutralized leadership, and economic collapse strongly supports the idea that decisive force is the prevailing reality of global power.
It certainly shapes the immediate landscape.
Right. When you apply overwhelming pressure, systems break. The very fact that the opposing ideology has to frame generational suffering and economic isolation as a success is in itself proof that material dominance controls the parameters of the conflict.
They are forced to redefine victory.
Exactly. It forces the resistant nation into a corner where its only conceivable victory is mere survival in a deeply degraded state.
And from the opposing side, the inability of that overwhelming external pressure to force an actual formal surrender proves that material force is fundamentally limited in what it can achieve.
Limited in finalizing the win, maybe?
Right, you can break the concrete, absolutely. But if the nation operates as an adapting, living ideology, the pressure merely creates a more unified, resilient resistance.
The immune response.
Exactly. The systemic adaptation and the sheer endurance of an ideological nation demonstrate that while material force can cause profound damage, it cannot dictate terms to a populace that values its sovereign independence over its material comfort.
I think where we find absolute convergence today is in the recognition that this source material outlines a total paradigm clash. Neither leader accepts the other's fundamental metrics for reality.
They're operating in completely different realities.
Trump literally cannot conceive of a victory that does not involve the opponent giving up and submitting to superior force. Khamenei literally cannot conceive of an independence that does not require immense sacrifice and suffering.
They are speaking two entirely different languages of power. One speaks the language of gravity and demolition, the other speaks the language of immunity and adaptation. Both frameworks possess an internal logic that perfectly justifies their respective actions, which is why these types of conflicts seem so intractable.
If you only look at the material metrics, you cannot understand why the resistance continues year after year. But if you only look at the ideological rhetoric, you completely miss the devastating practical realities of the physical destruction happening on the ground.
It requires us to constantly challenge our own ingrained assumptions about what power actually is and how we measure success in conflicts that span generations rather than news cycles.
Which brings us back to that engineering metaphor we started with. We are left looking at the structure.
And what do we see?
Well, one side points to the shattered concrete, the economic rubble, and says, look, we broke it, we won. The other side points to the foundation that still has not moved an inch and says, look, we're still here, we won.
It is a chilling thought.
Perhaps the true nature of modern geopolitical conflict is not about who can strike the hardest blow, but whether the material you are striking is designed to shatter or designed to adapt. There is undoubtedly much more to explore in how these doctrines shape the actual policies and lives on the ground, leaving us and you, the listener, to evaluate the source material and weigh these ultimate outcomes for yourselves.